June 1944. The coastline of northern France bristled with German concrete and steel. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had transformed Hitler's Atlantic Wall from a propaganda boast into a lethal reality. Miles of beaches mined, obstacles submerged beneath the tide, and overlooking it all, thousands of bunkers housing artillery and machine guns, sited to turn the sands of Normandy into a killing field. The German High Command held one unshakable conviction: a major amphibious invasion, especially one involving heavy armor, could only succeed if the Allies captured a deep-water port intact. Ports like Cherbourg or Le Havre were fortified into near-impregnable fortresses for precisely this reason. Landing tanks directly onto open beaches, under fire, was considered tactical suicide, a logistical impossibility. The core of their confidence lay in the simple, brutal physics of tanks versus water. An M4 Sherman tank weighed over 30 tons. It was a complex assembly of steel, delicate engine components, sensitive electrical systems, and precisely machined gears. It was designed for land warfare, for mud and dust, but seawater was its mortal enemy. Even a few inches of water ingress could stall the engine, short out the ignition, or corrode vital parts, rendering the entire machine useless. A 30-ton steel coffin stranded on the beach. German engineers, masters of complex sealing technology for their U-boats, knew that properly waterproofing a tank for anything more than shallow wading was a monumental task, requiring factory-level precision, specialized materials, and weeks of work. They assumed the Americans, masters of mass production but not necessarily finesse, could never achieve this reliably on the scale needed for an invasion. The Allied planners faced this grim reality. The disastrous Dieppe raid in 1942 had provided a horrific lesson. Tanks landed directly onto a defended beach without proper support were quickly destroyed. Traditional landing craft like the LCT, landing craft tank, could only bring tanks to the water's edge, often grounding hundreds of yards offshore. In those crucial yards, wading through surf under direct fire from anti-tank guns and machine guns, the Shermans were horrifyingly vulnerable. They needed tanks on the beach, operational in the very first wave, to provide the crucial firepower needed to breach the German defenses and allow the infantry to get off the sand. Without tanks leading the assault, the invasion risked becoming a massacre, bogged down at the waterline. The official solutions proposed were complex and inadequate. Amphibious tanks like the DD, duplex drive, Sherman, tanks equipped with inflatable skirts and propellers, were innovative but highly vulnerable to rough seas and required extensive specialized training. They couldn't carry the main weight of the initial armored assault. What was needed was a way to get standard battle tanks, the reliable M4 Shermans, thousands of which were waiting in England, ashore, and fighting within minutes of hitting the beach. The pressure fell on American and British engineers, not in the gleaming laboratories of Detroit or the established naval design bureaus, but often in muddy fields and makeshift workshops in England. They weren't tasked with designing a new superweapon. Their mission was far more mundane, yet strategically vital. Find a way to keep seawater out of a standard Sherman tank for the 5 or 10 minutes it would take to drive from a landing craft, through several feet of surf, and onto dry sand. The solution they devised wasn't a masterpiece of high technology. It was crude, ugly, almost insultingly simple, relying on basic materials: rubber sheeting, waterproof grease, simple metal clamps, and hastily fabricated exhaust snorkels that looked like misplaced stovepipes. To the German engineers obsessed with precision seals and watertight integrity, this field-expedient approach would have seemed like a dangerous joke. But this simple, cheap, mass-produced kit of rubber and sealant was about to become the key that unlocked Fortress Europe. The challenge facing Allied engineers wasn't to invent a revolutionary new amphibious technology. It was to find a brutally simple, mass-producible hack that could give a standard M4 Sherman tank about 10 minutes of protection against saltwater ingress. The solution emerged from a series of frantic, often classified experiments conducted in England in the months leading up to D-Day, driven by the grim realization that without effective armored support in the first wave, the invasion beaches would become slaughterhouses. The key players weren't high-level naval architects, but often anonymous army engineers and mechanics working with basic materials under immense time pressure. Their approach rejected the German obsession with perfect, permanent seals. They knew they didn't need submarine-level waterproofing. They needed a temporary barrier, effective enough to withstand moderate surf and several feet of water for the short, terrifying dash from the LCT ramp to the dune line. The result was a collection of components known collectively as the Deep Wading Kit. It wasn't a single invention, but a system of simple, almost crude, modifications designed to plug the Sherman's most obvious vulnerabilities. The core components were laughably basic compared to the complexity of the tank itself. Large sheets of heavy-duty rubberized canvas were cut to shape to cover the most critical openings: the engine air intakes on the rear deck, the main gun mantlet, and the turret ring. These covers weren't precision-molded seals. They were often held in place by simple metal clamps, straps, or even quick-drying waterproof adhesive tape. The goal was not a perfect seal, but a sufficient one. Joints and seams around hatches, vision ports, and hull plates were liberally slathered with thick, waterproof grease or heavy-duty caulking compound. This wasn't elegant engineering, it was brute force plugging, filling every potential gap where water might seep in under pressure. Mechanics used putty knives and caulking guns, applying the sealant with an urgency that prioritized coverage over neatness. The most visually distinctive components were the intake and exhaust stacks, tall, often crudely fabricated metal chimneys that extended vertically from the engine compartment. These snorkels allowed the powerful Wright radial engine, or later diesel engines in some variants, to continue breathing air and expelling exhaust even when the tank's hull was partially submerged. They were often made from simple sheet metal, sometimes scavenged and attached with basic bolts and gaskets. They looked like an afterthought, an ugly appendage tacked onto the tank's profile, but they were absolutely essential for preventing the engine from drowning in the surf. The entire kit was designed with two overriding principles: ease of mass production and speed of installation. The rubber sheets could be cut and stitched by factories that normally made tarpaulins or tents. The clamps were standard industrial hardware. The sealant was a common waterproofing compound. The snorkel stacks required only basic metalworking skills. This meant the kits could be produced by the thousands, quickly and cheaply, using non-specialized labor and materials, a critical advantage given the scale of the impending invasion. Installation was designed to be done in the field, often by the tank crews themselves, or by ordnance mechanics working on the crowded decks of transport ships just hours before the assault. The process was deliberately straightforward, involving simple clamping, sealing, and bolting. It was dirty, greasy work, but it didn't require advanced technical skills. This contrasted sharply with the hypothetical German approach, which would likely have involved dry docking the tank and employing specialized U-boat sealing techniques. The estimated cost of a complete deep wading kit was astonishingly low, perhaps $50 to $100 per tank in wartime currency. This minuscule investment, less than the cost of a single main gun round, was the key to unlocking the combat potential of a $50,000 tank in the most critical phase of the invasion. The German High Command, unaware of the scale and simplicity of this effort, continued to believe that landing standard tanks directly onto the beaches was logistically unfeasible. They were preparing for a battle against complex amphibious machines, not realizing the real threat came from ordinary Shermans wrapped in rubber, grease, and cheap sheet metal. A $5 fix designed to breach a billion-dollar fortress. The development and deployment of the deep wading kits was shrouded in remarkable secrecy, a testament to the Allies' understanding of just how critical this seemingly simple technology was to the success of D-Day. While the Germans anticipated specialized amphibious tanks like the D.D. Shermans, the concept of thousands of standard battle tanks simply driving through the surf was a possibility they had largely dismissed as impractical. Maintaining that illusion was paramount. Testing of the waterproofing methods was conducted under tight security, often on remote British beaches or in specially constructed training pools, far from prying eyes. Engineers and tank crews experimented relentlessly, refining the sealing techniques and identifying weak points. Early trials were often disastrous. Tanks stalled mid-wade, engines flooded, and crews narrowly escaped drowning as water poured through improperly sealed hatches or gun mantlets. Each failure, however, provided crucial data. They learned exactly how much sealant was needed, precisely where the rubber covers had to be clamped, and the maximum water depth a modified Sherman could realistically handle, typically around 6 to 7 feet, just enough to get off the LCT ramp and through the initial surf zone. The training for the tank crews was equally intense and secretive. Units designated for the first wave assault spent weeks practicing driving their waterproofed Shermans off mock landing craft ramps and into the cold, choppy waters of the English Channel. They learned the terrifying, unnatural sensation of piloting a 30-ton steel beast through water, relying solely on the periscope for vision and the tall exhaust stacks to keep the engine alive. They practiced emergency procedures for flooded engines and bailouts. Critically, they also learned how to remove the waterproofing gear rapidly once they reached the beach, ripping off the rubber covers and cutting away the snorkel stacks to bring their machine guns and main cannon into action as quickly as possible. The waterproofing was essential for getting ashore, but it rendered the tank largely defenseless during the wade itself. Speed of removal was just as vital as the effectiveness of the seals. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. Tens of thousands of deep wading kits had to be manufactured, distributed, and installed on the invasion force tanks in the final weeks and days before June 6th. This massive logistical effort took place under the constant threat of German aerial reconnaissance and espionage. kits were often delivered under cover of darkness, and the actual installation was frequently done below decks on the transport ships crossing the channel, using only basic tools and working in cramped, poorly lit conditions. The success of the entire D-Day armor strategy depended on thousands of ordinary mechanics and tank crews correctly applying grease, tightening clamps, and bolting on snorkels, often just hours before facing German machine guns. This secrecy paid off. German intelligence reports leading up to D-Day consistently underestimated the Allies' capability to land heavy armor directly onto the beaches in the initial assault waves. They focused their analysis on the specialized DD tanks, correctly identifying their vulnerabilities to rough seas, but largely discounted the threat posed by standard Shermans. They saw the LCTs approaching the shore and assumed the tanks would be forced to disembark at the water's edge, becoming easy targets during the long, slow wade. They were completely unprepared for the sight of dozens, then hundreds, of ordinary M4 Shermans driving directly off the ramps, plunging into the surf with their tall stacks spewing exhaust and churning their way towards the beach like improbable swimming monsters. The simple rubber seals and waterproof grease had created a strategic deception as effective as any complex code-breaking operation. The Germans had fortified the ports, but the Americans were bringing the port, in the form of mobile, waterproofed armor, directly to the undefended sands. The gray, turbulent waters of the English Channel churned violently on the morning of June 6, 1944. Aboard the hundreds of landing craft, tank, LCTs, grinding towards the Normandy coast, American and British tank crews made their final nerve-wracking checks. The air inside the cramped pitching vessels was thick with the smell of diesel fumes, vomit, and the acrid tang of waterproof grease. Visibility through the narrow vision slits was almost zero, obscured by spray and the smoke of the naval bombardment pounding the German defenses. For the men sealed inside their M4 Shermans, the world had shrunk to the vibrating steel hull, the roar of their own engines idling, and the terrifying uncertainty of what waited beyond the steel ramp. This was the moment the simple rubber seals and hastily applied sealant would face their ultimate test, not against calm training waters, but against the chaotic reality of enemy fire and the unpredictable violence of the sea. As the LCTs hit the sandbars, often hundreds of yards from the true waterline, the ramps crashed down. What the German defenders saw next defied their expectations and shattered their defensive doctrine. Instead of infantry struggling through the surf, followed by tanks gingerly disembarking at the water's edge, they witnessed the impossible. Dozens of standard M4 Sherman tanks driving directly off the ramps and plunging nose first into several feet of churning, obstacle-laden seawater. The tall, ungainly snorkel stacks, spewing thick exhaust smoke, were the only visible sign that these were not sunken wrecks, but operational fighting machines deliberately driving through the ocean. The first few yards were critical. Tank commanders, buttoned up and relying on periscopes, navigated the treacherous underwater terrain. Shell craters submerged obstacles and the bodies of fallen infantry. Engines roared as drivers fought to maintain traction on the loose sand beneath the waves. Water surged against the rubberized canvas covers, testing the integrity of every clamp and seal. Inevitably, there were failures. Some tanks, hitting unseen mines or obstacles, flooded instantly. Others, taking direct hits from German anti-tank guns before even clearing the ramp, became blazing pyres in the surf. A percentage of the waterproofing kits, perhaps installed too hastily in the dark or damaged during the rough crossing, failed under the pressure, leaving tanks stalled and helpless, quickly swamped by the rising tide. But the genius of the Allied plan was not perfection. It was scale and sufficiency. For every tank that failed, 2, 3, or 4 others made it. Churning through the surf, water cascading off their hulls, the Shermans crawled onto the wet sand like prehistoric beasts emerging from the sea. Crews immediately went into action, ripping off the restrictive canvas covers from the main gun and hull machine guns, often using built-in quick-release straps or simply slashing them away with knives. Drivers fought for traction on the loose shingle, pushing their tanks forward, seeking whatever minimal cover the beach offered. The immediate impact on the battlefield was decisive. The German defenses on beaches like Omaha and Utah were designed to stop infantry at the waterline. The sudden appearance of operational tanks, firing their 75mm cannons and machine guns directly into the bunkers and machine gun nests, completely disrupted the German defensive plan. These tanks provided the vital mobile firepower that allowed the first waves of infantry to survive the initial hail of fire, gain a foothold on the beach, and begin the slow, brutal process of moving inland. The simple rubber seals hadn't just waterproofed a tank. They had delivered the armored fist needed to punch through the Atlantic wall at its most vulnerable point. The gamble on a cheap field-expedient solution had paid off, turning a potential massacre into a viable, albeit costly, beachhead. The fortress built to stop an army was being breached by machines wrapped in glorified rubber tarpaulins. The sight of standard M4 Shermans driving through the surf was more than just a tactical surprise for the German defenders lining the Atlantic Wall. It was a fundamental violation of their engineering assumptions and military doctrine. German engineering culture, deeply rooted in precision, complexity, and specialized solutions, simply could not fathom that such a crude, seemingly temporary waterproofing method could function reliably on a massive scale under combat conditions. Their own limited experiments with tank waterproofing had involved complex factory-level modifications or specialized submersible designs, like the Tauchpanzer variants used earlier in the war, none of which were suitable for a mass amphibious assault using standard battle tanks. Intercepted German communications and post-battle interrogations revealed the extent of their disbelief and confusion. Initial reports from coastal bunkers described swimming tanks, often mistakenly identifying the snorkel-equipped Shermans as the more specialized but less numerous DD amphibious tanks. As the sheer number of standard M4s emerging from the water became undeniable, confusion turned to shock. German anti-tank gunners, trained to prioritize targets at the vulnerable waterline, found their carefully prepared kill zones bypassed by tanks that simply drove through the obstacles they expected to halt them. The psychological impact of seeing supposedly land-bound machines defy the ocean itself was significant, contributing to the breakdown of cohesion in some German defensive sectors. This American success was built on a philosophy diametrically opposed to the German approach. Where German engineering sought the perfect permanent solution, American engineering, particularly under wartime pressure, embraced the good enough, temporary, and massively scalable fix. The deep wading kit wasn't designed to make the Sherman a true amphibious vehicle. It was designed to solve a single, specific problem, surviving the transition from sea to land. Using the cheapest, most readily available materials and methods, it was inherently expendable. Once the tank was ashore and the immediate threat neutralized, the cumbersome snorkels and rubber sheeting were often ripped off and discarded. The goal was battlefield effect, not engineering elegance or long-term durability of the modification itself. This focus on expendability and field expediency permeated the entire American logistical approach to the invasion. While the Germans husbanded their resources relying on fewer, more complex pieces of equipment, the Americans relied on overwhelming numbers and the assumption that losses were inevitable but replaceable. The deep wading kit fit perfectly into this doctrine. It didn't matter if 10% or even 20% of the kits failed due to hasty installation or battle damage, as long as the remaining 80% got enough tanks onto the beach to break the crust of the German defenses. The success was statistical, not individual. Contrast this with the likely German approach had they faced a similar challenge. Their engineers would likely have insisted on developing a complex, reusable sealing system, requiring specialized training for installation and removal, and manufactured to exacting tolerances. This system, while perhaps technically superior in ideal conditions, would have been impossible to produce in the necessary quantities or install quickly enough for the D-Day timeline. The German pursuit of perfection would have made the entire concept of a mass, direct tank landing logistically impossible for them. The American willingness to accept imperfection, crudeness, and disposability in exchange for speed and scale was the key differentiator. The simple rubber seals were winning not just against the seawater, but against a fundamentally different and ultimately less adaptable engineering philosophy. The Atlantic Wall, built on the assumption of conventional limitations, was being breached by an unconventional, pragmatic approach to a simple problem. The strategic value of the waterproofed Shermans extended far beyond the initial chaos of the beach landings. Having tanks operational in the first hours allowed the Allies to rapidly consolidate their footholds and begin the crucial breakout into the Norman countryside. The ability to land armor directly onto open beaches freed the Allies from the immediate, desperate need to capture a major port, a task that proved incredibly costly and time-consuming, as the battle for Cherbourg would demonstrate. The simple rubber seals bought the Allies invaluable operational time. Without the immediate firepower provided by the Shermans that successfully waded ashore, the infantry pinned down on Omaha Beach might have been pushed back into the sea. These tanks, crude snorkels still attached or hastily ripped away, became mobile pillboxes, dueling with German strongpoints, suppressing machine gun nests, and providing the psychological boost needed for the infantry to push through the deadly beach exits. The deep wading kits enabled the creation of an armored spearhead, where none should have logically existed according to German defensive plans. Furthermore, the waterproofing capability proved vital in the subsequent weeks as Allied forces pushed inland. Normandy was crisscrossed with small rivers, streams, and flooded areas deliberately created by the Germans as obstacles. While major river crossings required specialized bridging equipment, the waterproofed Shermans could often ford smaller water obstacles that would have completely halted non-prepared vehicles or required lengthy detours. This ability to traverse minor water barriers maintained the momentum of local advances and often allowed American units to outflank German positions relying on rivers as natural defensive lines. The simple seals designed for the saltwater surf proved equally effective against the muddy freshwater streams of the French interior. German intelligence continued to struggle with the implications. Even after D-Day, their technical assessments often focused on the perceived flaws of the American waterproofing, its temporary nature, its vulnerability to damage, its reliance on crude materials. They failed to appreciate that these were not flaws, but features of a system designed for rapid, massive, and expendable deployment. They were analyzing the quality of the seal, while the Americans were winning with the quantity of tanks delivered across the water barrier. This misunderstanding had tactical consequences. German commanders, expecting American armored advances to be channeled along predictable routes dictated by intact bridges and shallow fords, were repeatedly surprised by Shermans appearing from unexpected directions, having crossed streams or flooded fields deemed impassable for tanks. The American willingness to risk drowning a few tanks to achieve tactical surprise was a concept alien to the more conservative, resource-conscious German doctrine. The deep wading kit was never intended to be a permanent modification or a perfect solution. It was a classic example of American wartime ingenuity, identifying a critical, specific problem, getting tanks through the surf, developing the simplest possible solution using readily available materials, rubber, grease, clamps, mass-producing it on an industrial scale and deploying it rapidly with minimal specialized training. It was ugly, it was temporary, and it sometimes failed. But it worked well enough, often enough, to overcome the most formidable coastal defense system in history and unleash the Allied armored juggernaut into the heart of France. The simple rubber seal was the unglamorous $5 key that unlocked the door to Fortress Europe. The story of the Sherman Deep Wading Kit resolves as a stark testament to the victory of pragmatic simplicity over theoretical perfection. The German High Command, secure behind the concrete and steel of the Atlantic Wall, had built their defenses based on the logical assumption that heavy armor could only assault through fortified ports. Their engineering prowess, focused on creating impenetrable U-boat seals and sophisticated submersible tanks, blinded them to the possibility of a simpler, cruder solution applied on an industrial scale. They prepared for a technological duel, failing to anticipate a brute force workaround. The American success on D-Day, enabled significantly by the waterproofed Shermans reaching the beach in force, was a direct refutation of this fortress mentality. The simple combination of rubber sheeting, waterproof grease, and sheet metal snorkels, a kit costing less than $100, effectively neutralized billions of Reichsmarks invested in coastal fortifications. It proved that the decisive factor was not the inherent quality of the defense, but the unexpected method of breaching it. The legacy of the deep wading kit is not found in museum displays of advanced technology. Its components were largely discarded moments after serving their purpose. Its true legacy lies in the operational doctrine it enabled, the ability to project massive armored force directly onto hostile shores without reliance on vulnerable pre-existing infrastructure. This capability fundamentally changed the calculus of amphibious warfare and became a cornerstone of American power projection for decades to come. The engineers and mechanics who devised and implemented this solution were not seeking elegance. They were seeking functionality under extreme duress. They embraced imperfection and disposability because those were the necessary prices for achieving speed and scale. They understood, perhaps instinctively, a core principle of industrial warfare that the German command structure consistently missed. The ability to rapidly deploy sufficient force is strategically superior to the ability to eventually deploy perfect force. The German engineers who might have laughed at the crude American seals were ultimately defeated by the operational consequences of that simplicity. While they meticulously calculated stress tolerances and waterproof ratings for permanent systems, the Americans were busy calculating how many tanks per hour they could get onto the beach using a temporary fix. The American system accepted losses as part of the equation. The German system, focused on preserving each valuable asset, was paralyzed by the risk inherent in mass assault. The final verdict is clear. The Atlantic Wall was breached not by a technological marvel, but by a profoundly simple, almost insulting hack, applied with overwhelming industrial force. The cheap rubber seals and sealant didn't just keep the water out of the Shermans, they drowned an entire doctrine built on the flawed assumption that complexity equates to strength. In the brutal calculus of D-Day, the $5 fix defeated the billion-dollar fortress.